Hello and welcome everybody, this is Simon Götzen with another episode of Simon Says at MTGOacademy.com, and today I want to talk about draft dynamics. Draft being one of the most complex things we do in Magic, and certainly limited Magic. So today we are going to try to model the concepts of drafting and trying to understand the complexity behind it. So what is draft exactly? Draft is actually a game of its own, and you play it with 8 players instead of just 2, and it has a very interesting cell balancing component. So if we look at the absolute core elements of drafting, we know that there is basically boosters being opened and players competing to reach their goals. And of course these boosters have cards of varying power levels and different colors, and these two themes are going to be important. Because what the players want to do is, on the one hand, maximize their deck utility while maintaining color consistency. And you can already see that the power level of the cards is going to affect the deck utility, while the different colors of cards, the 5 colors we have in Magic that define Magic at its core, are going to make it difficult to maintain color consistency. Or, to put it differently, the fact that there are multiple colors already give draft an interesting dynamic, because you aren't going to be able to play cards of all colors. Now, let's make this a little more concrete. I want to define very loosely a term I call deck utility. And of course, you can think of this as a measurement for the power of your deck, and of course it's going to scale with the power level of the individual cards. And you can continue this with thinking about the strategic cohesiveness and the synergies within your deck. But what is more important during the drafting process is that there's actually 2 utility barriers imposed by the rules of Magic, and one of them is that we are only going to play a limited amount of cards in our main deck. Of course, you could argue that a couple of cards are going to be relevant when we board them in, but on the one hand, they're going to be much less relevant than our main deck cards, and there are always going to be cards out of our 45 that don't add to our deck's utility. In fact, it doesn't make sense to play more cards than you need to make a 40-card deck. So the fact that only 23 cards count towards this deck utility promotes venturing, promotes experimenting, promotes trying out cards from different colors. The fact that we won't use all of our cards anyway allows us to pick cards of different colors without thinking about the future too much. We will just end up with good enough or a large amount of cards that are good enough anyway. So on the other hand, we have the color limitation, which is the topic of color consistency, of course. We know from experience that our decks should be 2-colored. We can have 1-colored decks, of course, but everything beyond 2 colors and a splash color is really pushing it. Sometimes you can have 3-color control decks, but you're paying this with one or two things. Either you get a drop in consistency, or you need to spend a lot of picks on cards like mana fixing that don't have a utility on their own. So there is always a trade-off there. And this concept of color limitation creates attachment. And as you can see, venturing and color attachment contradict each other. So what we get is, just from this very simple model, is already a 2-phase process where we have each player going through a venturing phase and then an attachment phase. In the venturing phase, he gets to try out powerful cards with high utility in different colors. In the attachment phase, it's more important to respect color limitations and see that we get the amount of playables that we need. And of course, these aren't 2 distinct phases, but there's a smooth transition from one phase to the other. The point where you move from venturing into attachment is actually one of the sweet spots of drafting. And to make it even more complicated, you will usually be in a different phase for each of the colors you are drafting. So while you might still already be attached to one of your colors, you might still be in a venturing phase for one or multiple other colors. So this is not only a 2-phase process, but also a multi-layered process for each player. And here we can already glimpse at why drafting is so complex. It's just a lot of different things going on multiple levels. Now, the topic of today is draft dynamics, and what creates the dynamics is that there are 8 people at the table opening boosters with random content, and basically you aren't sitting there with 7 robots or 7 AI opponents. These people are going to have preferences regarding colors or color combinations, and the way they evaluate cards is going to differ a lot from how you do. So this is a very individual thing where you should not only know what you are doing, but also what the others are doing. And just as I said, the phase of venturing, staying open, or being attached to a color and forcing it is not only a strategic decision, but it also depends on the player and, of course, the cards he opened. He's probably much more likely to be attached to a color if he opened a very high utility card, like a powerful mythic rare, of course. So sometimes drafting is described as picking one of two strategies: surfing or forcing, staying open as long as possible, or forcing a color. But it's important to see that these are actually only the two extreme points on the spectrum, only the defining moments of this phase transition we talked about on the last slide. And that leads us to some of the things that are, well, common knowledge, but it's still important to repeat them. If we take as the simplest example 8 players that draft 2 colors each, then we need to divide about 3 players per color. And of course it's best if these 3 players don't sit next to each other but are spread apart. And you try to maximize this, or each player tries to maximize this by positioning themselves in a color, sending and receiving signals with regard to the amount of cards flowing in one direction, the quality of cards flowing in one direction. And of course you can there is a lot of strategic depth, but this is not the time to discuss it. So the most important thing I added here is that the right neighbors see the majority of packs first. So the right neighbors dictate the quality of the cards in your color, and that makes it so important to try to stay out of that color. This is supposed to be a learning slideshow, a learning show, basically. I want you to not only be able to reproduce good Magic, but to get an understanding of the underlying concepts. And draft videos are not the best to understand draft dynamics, because they only show a local perspective. And what I try to talk about now is really a global perspective, taking into account the 8 players and the packs they are opening, and of course their personal behavior. Now, this is incredibly complex, I won't lie to you, so you will have to try to learn from each draft as much as possible. And this is especially important if you feel like your drafts are ending up in a weird spot too often. If you look at your right neighbor and he's drafting the same colors as you, this is not where you want to be. So in the real world, but also on Magic Online, talking to the players at your table might actually be a good idea to understand what happened, just on a very simple level. You can just ask them, how did you end up in this color? And people are usually happy to talk about these things, not only because it's fun, but also because they also want to learn. Now, if you are on Magic Online, you might not have these options, but you can still watch replays and then just take out a pen and take note of which players drafted which colors. And you can see that there might have been an imbalance towards one color, and if you drafted this color as well, maybe it's your fault, maybe not, but try to learn, try to take as much from the information offered to you as possible. Now, the other thing is to absorb as much limited coverage as possible, but sadly, usually these also only give you a local perspective of drafting and not a global perspective. But one thing I want to point out is that there is the draft viewer, which is, well, sometimes it shows drafts from Magic Online, but the major events often have 1 or 2 draft viewers that show each pick of each person. And I think that's a very valuable learning tool. And as a special treat, I suggest the Draft 1 of the World Magic Cup 2012, and Pot 4 was covered in a draft viewer. And I think it's a very interesting draft to check out and to compare these theories, these models, with a real-life example. And I actually have a little treat for you here. This is only the first 4 picks, and as a result, only the first 4 cards out of each pack. And if you are well, remotely like me, your first reaction is, this is far too much information already. Now, this is only a tiny portion of the information you can get out of the draft viewer. But the reason I'm showing you this slide is that you can actually see some of the draft dynamics very visually. And the way this is set up is that the contents of the boosters are in the columns and the picks are in the rows. So if you're asking yourself, what is player 1 doing? Player 1 first picked a Tyrant's Invocation out of a pack with Volcanic Gazer, Searing Spear, and Voidstalker, and then continued drafting Arctic Aven, got past a Silklash Spider, and then he picked an Attendant Knight, probably because he was tending towards white because of the ability of Arctic Aven. Now, if we see this, we see that the neighbor of player 1, player 2, actually picked Duty-Bound Dead over Silklash Spider, which is incredible if you compare the power level of these two cards. However, if we follow what this guy is doing, we see that he isn't really concerned with signaling or individual power level. This is a person that's forcing a Black-White Exalted deck. And this has repercussions throughout the whole draft, especially when you see that there is 3 black cards being opened next to each other, and a 4th black card being first picked. So we already know that there is probably going to be some kind of clash regarding the black cards, and not everybody is going to be able to draft them. Now, the way to read this is if you look at player 7, for example, who opened up with Yeva and got past the Flinthoof Boar, then you see his next picks over here. So we have player 7 starting off strongly with red-green, and player 3 starting strongly with red-green as well, and they are positioned quite nicely with the maximum distance between each other. Alexander Hain, who was in this draft, did an individual draft feature with BDM, I believe, and he's player 8, first picking Sarah Avenger, and then following it up with these cards. So, as you can see, I only touched upon some of the basic things happening here, but if you actually open up the draft viewer on the Daily MTG mothership side, you can of course analyze this in much more detail. And there's actually a Roaring Primadox and an Acidic Slime in these packs that aren't even drafted before pick 5. But we can already see that there's quite a lot of cards of questionable power level, and this is a very high level event, so we can assume that most of these people know what they're doing, and well, the picks are the result of conscious strategic decisions. So I enjoyed this draft a lot. I think it's great that Wizards offers us this opportunity, and I think that everybody who's trying to get better at Limited should definitely check out this draft and continue checking out draft viewers offered by Wizards. With that, I will say bye, check out my draft, and maybe you can see what kind of strategies and color attachments I followed during this M13 draft. Enjoy the show. Bye bye.